Many of you might remember that a number of years ago, my 3-year-old godson, Ronan, was diagnosed with a rare disease called dyskeratosis congenita. You prayed with me during that time. You registered to be bone marrow donors. You blessed a prayer shawl, which I have to mention he hasn't slept without in 8 years. It was a very difficult time for me and for his family, and we didn't know what the next day would bring, and it was very clear that he would not make it without that life-saving bone marrow donation. And so when the news came that a man living in a country far away was a match for Ronan, it gave us hope for the future. It gave us hope that science might catch up and that this little boy might have a chance at life. And the bone marrow transplant worked. His body did not reject it, and he began to regain his health. But unfortunately, this story doesn't end with happy butterflies and rainbows. This story continues with challenge and uncertainty. It continues with an 11-year-old boy who loves Minecraft and feeding the chickens, but who can't be in the sun too long because of his high cancer risk. It continues with a family that doesn't know what his future will look like, but are fighting through doctor's appointments, all the while trying to maintain his life as a normal kid. And so a few months back, Ronan's mother took him to do some research on the Oregon Trail for school. They ended up visiting a cemetery where some of the travelers were buried, and Ronan was enamored by this cemetery. He was interested in learning about all the history, about each story, about each person buried there. And at the end of the visit, he looked up at his mother and asked her if he could be buried there. And so I imagine for any parent, the concept of their child asking about death would be unnerving. But for this family, the concept is a very real one and something that is present in their day-to-day lives. They live with the reality that they will likely bury their child at some point. And so when Ronan asked if he could be buried at that particular cemetery, his mother told him that she would do anything she could to make that happen. And so she went home and she began researching the cemetery. She learned that it belonged to the Masons, and that the only way to be buried there is to have a family member who is a Mason or be one yourself. And so this presented a problem since none of the family members belonged to the Masons. So his mother reached out to many different people to see if they could make the arrangements, but it remained unclear as to how this would happen. A few weeks ago, I found out that Ronan's father is in the process of joining the local Mason Lodge. And even standing here retelling you this story brings tears to my eyes and a lump in my throat when I think of the love that is going into making sure that Ronan is buried where he wants to be. And I pray the day that Ronan is buried is long after his parents or I am on this earth. But in case that doesn't happen, his parents have made every effort to honor his wishes. Our story today, the story of the Good Samaritan, is probably one of the most retold stories in our scriptures. I imagine that if many of us think back to those early Sunday school days, we might remember the Good Samaritan. It was even one of our central scriptures last year at Vacation Faith School here at IUCC. And so there must be something about the Good Samaritan story that makes it so commonly used in Sunday school. There must be something about the story that gets even folks of other religious traditions familiar with it. There must be something that gets right to the core of Jesus' message. And I think that it's probably even more radical than we usually give it credit for. Yes, it's about helping those in need, but I don't think we actually fully understand the gravity of this story. We hear the story of the traveler being beaten, stripped naked, and left half dead. He wasn't just limping alongside the road. We can imagine that he was bloody, naked, and absolutely destroyed. And still the priest, the person we would assume would always stop, does not, and instead passes by on the other side of the road. Maybe the traveler was even moaning or calling out for help, and another, a Levite, passes by without helping. And when all hope seems to be lost, a Samaritan stops and helps the traveler. A Samaritan, a person considered to be unclean and heretical, the person nobody expects to stop, stops. And not only does he stop, but the Samaritan tends to the traveler's wounds personally. He checks him into an inn, pays the innkeeper, and assures him that if there's any added expense, that he will pay for it. And the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, in talking about the story of the Samaritan, says, "Had I but one wish for today's Christian churches of America, I think it would be that they come to see the difference between charity and justice. Charity is a matter of personal attributes. Justice is a matter of public policy. Charity seeks to alleviate the effects of injustice. Justice seeks to eliminate the causes of it. Charity in no way affects the status quo, while justice leads to inevitably a political confrontation. Especially, I would hope that Christians would see that the compassion that moved the Good Samaritan to act charitably, that same compassion prompted biblical prophets to confront injustice, to speak truth to power, as did Jesus, who, though more than a prophet, was certainly nothing less." And the difference that Coffin is trying to highlight here is that personal charity, giving to others, the Samaritan offering and stopping for help, is of course something that should be emulated and appreciated, but it is empty without the context of the fact that Jesus is using this story to teach others about the possibility of systemic change. And instead of just telling the crowds about the person who did stop, Jesus points out the people who didn't stop. As much as he is highlighting the Samaritan who tended to the man's wounds, he is also pointing out that the priest and the Levite, the people who should have stopped, did not. And so what then is the thing that inspires us to move from charity, from individual care and concern, which of course is of great importance, into a place of justice and systemic action? It seems to me that the major difference between charity and justice is relationship. If we each think of the things that we are most passionate about, the issues that we are willing to fight for, I'm willing to bet that there's some level of individual connection you have with people affected by that particular injustice. Before Ronan was diagnosed with dyskeratosis congenita, I imagine I might have been willing to give $10 to an online fundraiser. I might have even read a pamphlet about the disease, but I'm not sure I would have expended significant investment. What moved me from charity to justice is a connection to Ronan, is seeing the way he was affected by the disease. What inspired me to ask people to become bone marrow donors, what inspired me to raise funds for new scientific trials, what inspired me to ask anyone and everyone in my life to pray for Ronan was, at the end of the day, a deep love and connection and relationship to a 3-year-old boy who might die if I didn't do so. And so in contemporary American society, especially the year before our next presidential election, we find ourselves constantly faced with issues that plague the world: immigration, reproductive rights, racial justice, gender and sexual orientation, socioeconomic issues. We're either on this side of an issue or this side of an issue, and sometimes we get so sucked into the issue that we forget about the relationship. The thing that propels us to want to change systemic injustice is because we care about the human beings that are affected by the issues, not the issues themselves. If the Samaritan had operated purely out of charity, maybe he would have just left the traveler some money. Maybe he would have tried to tell someone that the man was injured, but he wouldn't have invested his time, his money, and even promised to come back after his trip to check on the man. When I think about the love that my godson's parents have for him in wanting him to be able to be buried in a particular cemetery, it becomes abundantly clear that love, connection, relationship propels us into a place of action in a way that sympathy or guilt or obligation never can. When we hear and read the stories in the headlines this week, it might be tempting to go right for the issue at hand. It might feel easier to have a political debate over immigration or asylum seeking, but instead of doing that, the call of Jesus, the call of justice, is to move past the issue and into the relationship, because real human beings are being separated from their families. Real human beings are being inhumanely detained. Real human beings are being told that they are criminals and animals. And so honestly, the issue of immigration, the legality or the political implications, they pale in comparison to the lives at stake. The fear that families are feeling as ICE raids begin all over the country, the pain of being ripped away from all normalcy and stability, that is what we must be compelled to change and to address. Because we are in relationship with every other human being on this planet. We are called to love our neighbor as ourselves, and not in just some shallow or even charitable way, but in a way that promotes justice and healing for every single person. And so I ask you, who have you passed by recently without seeing their humanity? When have you crossed to the other side of the road and avoided Jesus' call for justice? We all do it. I can think of far too many times when I have passed homeless folks without looking into their eyes and realizing their humanity. I can think of times where I have not fully listened to the pain of another. I can think of times where I have been so concerned with my own challenge or pain that I have been unable to see the challenge or pain in another. And so the lesson of the Good Samaritan reminds us to continually seek out relationship, to seek real, comprehensive justice, and to follow in the footsteps of our Christ, acknowledging every person's humanity and inherent value in the world. Because charity is good and important, but justice is healing and sustainable and is the true calling of being a Christian in the world today. Amen, and blessed be.